Good morning, afternoon, evening, or whenever you're listening to this podcast. Welcome to the second audio episode of our built environment. This week, I've been thinking all about social media. Not because I've been scrolling Twitter too long, well, though I have, or scrolling Instagram. I don't have the Instagram app anymore, or any other social media platform. I've been thinking about it for slightly different reasons. I promise you, it's still urbanism, real estate, housing, planning related, just slightly different than things that we normally talk about in these worlds. For most companies, going viral on multiple social media platforms would be a major win. And I've been thinking about this virality because marketing departments spend millions of dollars every year trying to do just this. In the last week, Zillow hasn't had to spend a single dime to get this type of coverage. They've gained millions of organic views across TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, and other platforms, getting an almost unfathomable amount of engagement. But I can't imagine Zillow is all too happy with the coverage they've had. That's because their virality has come by way of criticism on TikTok. Sean Goucher, and I hope, Sean, I'm pronouncing that right, maybe it's Goucher, a Nevada-based real estate broker, claimed in the video on TikTok that Zillow is manipulating housing markets through its iBuying program. Now, this video spread like wildfire, with a chorus of sympathetic voices chiming in across the internet to denounce Zillow, the practice of iBuying, and capitalism generally. And there's a good chance that if you see a type of criticism lobbed at corporations on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, it probably will tie in eventually to capitalism. It's kind of like the 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon. You're 6 degrees away from the fall of capitalism anywhere on social media. But, there's just one problem with all these claims. They're not supported by much evidence and beyond the basic details of Zillow's program. All of these tweets joining in sympathy with Sean are not really based in fact. This brings up an important set of questions. How could so many people jump onto a narrative that's so easy to verify as false? Is this a sign of craziness in our housing markets that people are willing to think this way? Our economy generally? Social media? Or kind of a mix of all three? And what exactly are Zillow and other platforms like it doing in our housing markets today? This is Our Built Environment, and I'm your host, cobylefko. Today, we're talking iBuying, online real estate marketplaces, and the role of social media in housing discourse. If you want to read the piece, head on over to cobylefko at medium.com or marker.medium.com and look for Zillow. Or if listening's more your thing, listen on. We'll get into it in a second. All right. Zillow isn't buying all the homes on your block. The dangerous allure of using easy anecdotes to explain complex problems. It all started on TikTok. These 5 words could probably explain much of what's happening in popular culture today. They also inspire fear, excitement, or confusion depending on who's reading them. But instead of touching on the latest dance craze, life hacks, celebrity drama, or cute dog videos here, this piece is focused on a much more sober subject, the housing market. In the last year, home prices have risen dramatically. Since the middle of 2020, the Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index has gone nearly vertical. But this much is obvious to anyone who's even been passively following the news. This piece doesn't seek to explain why prices are increasing, but if you're interested in learning more, head on over to my Medium page and you'll be able to read some pieces, specifically the one, No, We're Not in a Bubble, that dives into the issue of prices much more. But this piece tackles the public reaction to those prices. And right now, there's no better barometer for that sentiment than on social media. Last week, a real estate broker from Nevada took to TikTok to discuss what he viewed as manipulation of the housing market from real estate listings platforms like Zillow and Redfin. In it, he discussed iBuying, the relatively new strategy used by listing platforms to acquire properties all cash from sellers on their platforms sight unseen, who in turn are looking for a quicker, more efficient closing process than has traditionally been the case. They then make some repairs and try to flip the properties for a quick profit. He criticized the practice, claiming, without evidence, that these platforms are scooping up homes around the country in an attempt to artificially increase market prices by selling one of those homes for an inflated rate. It's worth noting that he, along with all of the brokers, stand to lose a great deal with iBuying, as these platforms make traditional realtors redundant by cutting out middlemen and taking far lower fees. so we have to take his words with a grain of salt. But social media hasn't. In the days since, the video has been shared widely. It's amassed more than 2.8 million views at the time of writing or speaking on TikTok, and several million more on Twitter. Many viewers seem to be sympathetic to the criticism, with the comment section on TikTok and commentary on other social media platforms like Twitter full of consenting voices and personal anecdotes. Affirmations of how massive corporations are indeed at the root of the inability of everyday Americans to afford a home were widespread. The story has been reduced to one of corporate greed and has subsequently been added to the long list of transgressions unique to a capitalist society. If the story sounds familiar to you, it's because it is. A few months ago, nearly the same exact accusations were levied at BlackRock and other private equity firms. Is there any truth to these claims? And if there isn't, why has the narrative persisted? What does the data say about iBuying? Zillow launched its iBuying service, Zillow Offers, in April of 2018. Because Zillow is a publicly traded company, we can track all of the moves they made with their offers program and see how well they performed. From April of 2018 through the second quarter of 2021, this year, Zillow has bought 17,020 homes and sold roughly 14,000. To put these numbers into perspective, there are 86 million single-family homes in America. Last year, 6.5 million homes were sold. This year, we're already on track to sell 7 million. Of those 6.5 million homes, only 4,100 were bought by Zillow, which represents less than 0.1% of all transactions. And we should note here, too, that Zillow doesn't just acquire single-family homes. They're also acquiring condos and townhouses, attached townhouses, in their iBuying program. So the share of transactions is probably even less than 0.1%. So very, very small. And that's hardly market moving at all. Some might counter and say that Zillow has a more localized effect. You can't look at the national level of transactions. And all it takes is a few homes in one neighborhood to move prices up. Now, this makes sense on the surface, but it doesn't really pass scrutiny. Offers currently operates in 25 markets in entire metropolitan areas, home to 90 million people. From cities like Fort Collins, Colorado, all the way up to Los Angeles, California. And though Fort Collins and Colorado Springs in Colorado are the smallest metros that Zillow Offers operates in, most of the homes that Zillow has bought has been in the larger markets like Vegas, Los Angeles, so large that the presence of Zillow isn't really felt. The acquisition of 4,000 homes spread across markets where more than 250,000 Americans live doesn't really move the needle. It's tough to dismiss the acquisition of 17,000 homes entirely, though, and the $4.5 billion generated from the sale of another 14,000. We'll need to look a little bit deeper into the offers program to understand the scope of it. Though these numbers might seem to indicate success, Zillow is actually losing money on their iBuyer segment. To date, they've lost $667 million. They've lost almost $750 million buying homes. That's arguably impressive in a time when the housing market has increased by more than 30% in value. Since they meaningfully began buying homes in 2019, the average value of Zillow's sold homes has increased by just 16%. If Zillow has been intentionally inflating home values, they've done a pretty awful job at it. A spokesperson from Redfin countered claims of manipulating the market with higher prices succinctly, if sardonically, explaining they don't do this because intentionally overpaying for homes would be a terrible business model. It would be, especially because Redfin's iBuying business is also unprofitable, according to the latest financial disclosures. While financials aren't readily available for other top iBuyers, as they're not publicly traded, their scale of operations is roughly similar. Opendoor, the largest iBuyer in the country, bought 11,000 homes and sold 7,000 last year, more than twice the amount of the second largest iBuyer, OfferPad. Looking at these numbers, we can see that instead of inflating prices, iBuyer acquisitions are actually cheaper than the average home on the market, ostensibly to try and offset the thin margins of flipping homes. This is the one side of the sales process they can control, as they can't force people to pay inflated prices for their properties. According to a report from Redfin, the average value of homes that iBuyers have acquired is roughly 6% lower than the median average in the markets they operate in. So even if the homes they sell are more expensive than they acquired them for, net of fees and closing costs, we know they're still losing money. This means that the tight margins they're selling their homes for aren't large enough to be deemed inflationary to the market. We also know that the percentage increase in valuation at which iBuyer properties have been sold at is lower than the national increase in valuation. All told, iBuyers now control about 1% of real estate sales, a record high for the industry as of 2021. Now, looking at the data, we can say with a fair degree of confidence that iBuyers haven't been the culprit of rising home prices in the US. If iBuyers aren't inflating prices, why the criticism? The nature of our housing crisis is that it's not a local, regional, or even state problem. It's nationally pervasive, profoundly impacting millions of people around the country. Fully understanding the crisis is difficult, both for its scope and our sheer inability to handle it. How could the wealthiest nation in the history of the world not be able to adequately provide housing for its people? This goes well beyond tents on the street. Homeless encampments are the most visible manifestation of the crisis, but sadly, they're just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of our housing instability and insecurity is largely unseen. Nearly half of American households are burdened by housing costs, which means they spend more than 30% of their gross income towards housing, with 17.5 million households paying more than 50% of their gross income towards housing expenses. That bears repeating. 17.5 million households in America spend more than 50% of their gross income towards housing expenses. This doesn't mean 17.5 million people. It's likely anywhere from mid-30 to 50 million people, depending on household size. The average household in the U.S. is, I think, like 2.5 people, maybe slightly less. That's tens of millions of people who are spending more than 50% of their gross income on housing. And at this severely cost burden level, and that's the definition used by affordability agencies, severely cost burdened, it's nearly impossible for anybody to have a semblance of security in their financial or housing lives. To make matters worse, there's a linear relationship between affordability and housing quality. Because cost-burdened households aren't able to afford maintenance through no fault of their own, there's just not enough money to pay for maintenance, their housing quality deteriorates. In effect, they're paying more money to get worse quality. So in large cities like New York City, for example, NYCHA, which is the Public Housing Authority, is home to hundreds of thousands of people who don't have heat oftentimes in the winter, or air conditioning in the summer. Windows may be broken, elevators may be broken, basic habitability standards are not being met, and yet these folks are paying a high proportion of their income towards that housing. Now, thankfully, if you're in public housing, there is some limit to threshold of what you can pay, but if you're in the private market, there is no limit, and you're likely still dealing with a lot of these similar issues. It's really quite difficult. Now, it's easy to understand that the embodied consequences of this are significant. If it's cold outside in the winter and you don't have heat and your windows are cracked, that's obviously a very distressing circumstance. But the mental toll is equally as harsh and something that's not as explored. Having to think through living through those conditions every single day and not feeling that comfort is very difficult. But it goes beyond that. Because we spend so much time on our phones today, there's so much prosperity readily available to browse on Zillow or YouTube that's magnified by social media platforms. It must feel like the country and system have turned their backs on these folks who are spending more than half their income on housing. And it's hard not to understand why they would feel like that. For a challenge like this that many people face, it's only natural that we try to find clean-cut, rational justifications for something that's otherwise irrational and incomprehensible. If social media does one thing well, it's to harness and effectuate collective forms of knowledge, which help us to rationalize complex problems and the complex situations people are in. On one end of the spectrum, posts can go viral on social media because they already resonate with a group of people. This is pre-existing collective knowledge. On the other end of the spectrum, new forms of collective knowledge are created. Think memes or entirely novel operating paradigms like Web3 or cryptocurrency or any number of things. that wouldn't have been possible without the internet or social media. These new paradigms come to be accepted and work their way into our zeitgeist. This happens at an incredibly fast pace and compounds at a much higher rate than in the real world. Memes build on top of memes. Collective knowledge becomes referential, where the only way one can understand what's going on is if they've been following all the other threads that have come before. If you don't get the first meme, you won't get the 10th that it's built on top of. This is why if you've been offline for a month, it can feel like a year, and maybe more in meme culture. Arguably, the most powerful form of collective knowledge in online real estate is home browsing. Looking through listings has long been a form of aspirational escapism. Historically, when one would travel to a new place or walk by their local real estate broker's office, the temptation to see what homes cost, what they look like, or imagine oneself living there would just be irresistible. In the last year, as we've been forced to spend all of our time in our homes, this temptation moved online and exploded to new levels. Furthered by a mix of dissatisfaction in our own homes and a curiosity born out of boredom, home browsing became a collective pastime. Zillow surfing was chronicled by the Times. SNL's skit about Zillow has been viewed nearly 6 million times as of the time of writing. Clearly, there's strong collective knowledge surrounding the process of online home browsing. Combine this phenomena with an ever-worsening housing crisis, a public consciousness of rampant inequality shepherded by hyper-capitalist policies, and the scaling up of iBuying, and the perfect narrative is developed for how listings platforms are manipulating the market. Deliver this narrative on the most powerful algorithm ever created, et voila. A new form of collective knowledge is created on a viral scale. Whether this narrative is actually true or merely plausible is of little importance. The distinction doesn't matter, because once social media accepts something to be true and weaves it into its fabric of collective knowledge, it goes. Now, as people, we crave easy answers as a way of understanding complex problems. This is how personal anecdotes can become laws of the land and generally accepted truths. If we've seen something in our own lives, why shouldn't it be true across the board? And if someone we know and trust, whether in real life or online, believes it, who are we to doubt them? Assigning all of our problems to one bogeyman, be it Zillow, Redfin, private equity, or capitalism as a whole, neatly allows us to move on and not think much about the problem. This collective knowledge snowballs out of convenience and out of the anecdotes that we tell about things that we might have seen on a tweet without evidence or from a family member or a neighbor. And these things become accepted without question. It wouldn't be outrageous to hear people say, the housing crisis? Oh yeah, it's Zillow's fault. But Zillow's a large company everyone knows is spending billions of dollars buying up all of the houses, so we can't do anything about it. This sort of fatalism is appealing because it removes personal responsibility from the stakes of the issue. We can be radicalized by imagined grievances, but not radicalized into action. Rather, a resigned state of blame that absolves all personal guilt. Why does this matter? Some of you might be thinking at this point, so what? A few multi-billion-dollar companies have to deal with some PR difficulties for a couple of days. This doesn't matter. And besides, why are we talking so much about social media? Normally, I'd be inclined to agree, and I'm the last person to want to dive deep into social media. I'm not a shareholder in Zillow or Redfin, and I'm indifferent to the mission of protecting their shareholders' interest or how those shareholders or non-shareholders perceive these companies online. However, as I argued in Are Private Equity Firms to Blame for Rising Home Prices, the problem with pinning blame on an easy scapegoat isn't about fairness, but of distraction over how to solve the existential problems many face today. Simply declaring iBuyers the issue and reining them in, even if this narrative were true, would do nothing to solve the housing crisis. This is because without more housing, existing homes will continue to get more expensive, regardless of who's buying them, which, by the way, is disproportionately middle and upper class people, not corporations. It's something to the effect of 90% of all single-family homes are acquired by individual families and not private equity firms or iBuyers. These narratives take away from the critical work that must be done. The danger of seemingly innocuous posts going viral is that they can come to be broadly accepted and woven into the fabric of our collective knowledge. When these posts are accepted implicitly, they form a foundation for which future knowledge can compound off of. It's not difficult to imagine Zillow is buying all of the homes, and Zillow is causing the housing crisis, compounding to no entity should be allowed to profit off of housing. Indeed, this is the very line of thinking that's become popular among certain online communities today. This can have potentially dangerous real-life impacts as online communities mobilize offline to oppose the construction or improvement of homes. In the middle of a ubiquitous housing crisis, we can't risk a scenario when the only way to build new housing at scale is through the private sector. This isn't a defense of capitalism or developers, but a common sense answer for anyone who wants to provide quality housing for all. And that should be the goal. Though it would be noble, there just isn't enough public money to build non-private housing. To borrow from an earlier piece, HUD's entire budget in 2020 was $44.1 billion. The primary tool used by the federal government to encourage affordable housing, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC, only leverages a further $10.9 billion in funding for housing annually. These national numbers amount to less than a fifth of the funding needed to address the Bay Area's housing needs alone. How would we be able to provide enough housing for the entire country if the entire federal budget only satisfies 20% of one metropolitan area's affordable housing needs? It's just unfathomable to think that we could accomplish our needs through public financing alone. We have to look towards the private markets, no matter what one's ideology may be. And that's difficult because the truth is often messy and difficult to take up. It's inconvenient, unsatisfying, nuanced, and complex. It's also really difficult to grapple with the fact that as a nation, we've utterly failed our people. We haven't put a strong enough priority on providing respectable, decent housing for all Americans, and hearing someone who works in development saying, let developers build more housing, certainly feels like it's taking advantage of that system. I'm very well aware of how this sounds. But this isn't the fault of corporations. Through regulation and budget cuts, our ability to build that housing has been decimated. The corporations are merely playing a game within the confines of our own creation that's made it difficult to provide housing. While it makes sense that we seek out narratives that we can easily attach to, our collective knowledge on social media is currently attached to the wrong ones. So here's to a narrative we can all wrap our heads around. America is in the middle of a desperate housing crisis because our laws have restricted us from building more homes for people to live in. The only way we can alleviate this housing crisis is to allow for more housing to be built. When that housing is built, it should be of the highest quality and beauty possible so that people who live there can live in a fundamentally decent and dignified way. We're faced with two options. Either we can take our housing crisis seriously and adopt a new collective knowledge, or we can point fingers at convenient scapegoats on social media and watch the problems get worse. For my part, let's build. This has been Our Built Environment. Thanks for listening.